Silas Vance didn't care much for the passage of time. Out here, in the high, jagged reaches of the Nevada desert, time wasn't measured by ticking gears or swinging pendulums. It was measured by the length of the shadows on the canyon floor, and the way the air turned from a kiln to a freezer the second the sun dipped behind the peaks. He lived in a cabin built of cedar and stubbornness, miles from the nearest town, and even further from a man he used to be. He was a man of 60. He had his horses as hounds, and a silence so thick you could almost lean against it. But that night, the silence didn't just sit there. It held its breath. It started with a sound that didn't belong to the desert. It wasn't the scream of a mountain lion or the rhythmic trot of a mule deer. It was the sound of something dragging itself through the sagebrush. Silas reached for the Winchester leaning against the doorframe before the first knock even landed. When he opened the door, the cold air rushed in like an intruder, and there she was. She wasn't more than 25, but she looked a century old. Her dress, one of fine yellow silk, was shredded to the waist. Her feet were bare, bleeding into the dust of his porch. But it was her face that made Silas's blood turn to slush. Her skin was the color of a winter moon, pale, translucent, and shimmering with a cold, greasy sweat. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked up at him, her pupils blown wide, until her eyes were nothing but two black holes of terror. "Silas Vance?" she whispered. Her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. He didn't ask how she knew his name. He didn't ask who would chase her across 10 miles of rimrock. He just stepped aside, caught her as her knees gave out, and carried her toward the heat of the wood stove. If you have been following this story from the start, let me know in the comment. She was light, too light, like a bird with broken wings. He laid her on the heavy wool blankets by the fire and did what men like him have always done. He built the heat. He fetched the water. He kept his mouth shut. For an hour, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of pine knots and the girl's ragged breathing. Silas sat in his rocking chair, his shotgun across his lap, watching her. Every few minutes, her body would rack with a tremor so violent it rattled the floorboards. She would moan, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from her very bones. Is it over yet?" she moaned, her eyes fixed on the ceiling rafters. Silas looked at the heavy brass clock on his mantel. It was an old thing, a relic from his time in the cavalry. It ticked with a heavy, metallic heart. 10 past 11. "You're safe now, girl," Silas said, his voice like gravel grinding on stone. "Nobody's coming through that door tonight. Not while I'm breathing." She turned her head toward him, and for the first time, he saw the mark. On the side of her neck, hidden by her matted hair, was a small, purple puncture. It wasn't a snake bite. It was too clean, too deliberate. It looked like the prick of a needle. His stomach did a slow, sickening roll. He'd seen that mark once before, years ago, in a border town where men dealt in shadows and slow deaths. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice lower now. The deputy," she wheezed. "Miller," he said. "He said if he couldn't have the land, nobody would have the girl. He gave me a drink, said it would make the running easier." Silas didn't blink, but inside, a fire was starting that no rain could put out. Deputy Miller, a man with a badge and a soul, like a rotted stump. Sarah, that was the name he found on a locket around her neck, gripped his hand then. Her fingers were ice. "Is it over?" "The pain, it's moving. It feels like spiders in my veins." Silas looked at the clock again. 11:30. He remembered the stories of the Mariposa. The midnight hour arrived with a howl of wind that shook the cabin to its foundations. Silas didn't move from her side. He had used every poultice he knew. He had tried to make her bleed the venom out, but her blood was thick, dark, and sluggish. Sarah's breathing had changed. It wasn't a wheeze anymore. It was a whistle, a long, hollow sound like wine through a cracked pipe. "Silas," she whispered. Her eyes were clouded over now, the green iris disappearing into the gray. "Why is it so dark? The fire did go out?" The fire was roaring. The cabin was hot enough to make Silas's own shirt cling to his back. "It's just the cloud, Sarah," he lied. He'd told many lies in his life, but this one felt like a lead weight in his throat. The moon's just gone hiding. Keep your eyes on me. Stay in the light. I see them, she said, her voice suddenly clear. I'm almost happy. The lilies, they're everywhere. In the garden, Mama's garden. Silas felt a tear, hot and unwanted, track through the deep wrinkles of his cheek. He looked at the clock. 12:15. The Mariposa poison followed a timeline as strict as a hanging judge. Sundown to midnight was a struggle. Midnight to 1 was a vision. And at 1 o'clock, the heart simply forgot how to beat. He realized then that Miller hadn't just poisoned her. He had timed it. He had sent her running, knowing she would find the only man for 20 miles who could help her. He wanted Silas to watch. He wanted the man who had once humiliated him in front of the town to feel the ultimate helplessness. It was a cruelty so refined could only come from a man who wore a star to hide his rot. Suddenly, Silas's hound began to bay in the barn. It wasn't their stranger bark. It was their kill bark. Silas stood up. His joints popped like pistol shots. He checked the load in his Winchester. He checked the Colt .44 at his hip. He looked at Sarah. I'll be right back, Sarah, he whispered. I'm just going to go put the stars back in the sky. He stepped out onto the porch. The moon was high and cold, casting long skeletal shadows across the yard. 3 riders were sitting their horses just outside the circle of his lantern light. In the middle was Miller. He was wearing a heavy sheepskin coat, his badge glinting like a predator's eye. Evening, Silas, Miller called out. His voice was oily, full of a secret satisfaction. Understand you've got some stolen property in there. A girl who belongs to the county. Silas stepped down off the porch. He didn't carry the rifle like a threat. He carried it like an extension of his own arm. She's not property, Miller, Silas said. And she's not yours. Not anymore. Miller laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound. Is she still breathing? Last I checked, the clock was running out on that one. That's the thing about those mountain lilies. They don't care about your Winchester. They don't care about your reputation. The 2 deputies on Miller's flanks shifted in their saddles. They were young, hired guns with 10 stars. They looked at Silas Vance, and they saw a legend they didn't believe in. Step aside, old man, one of the deputies shouted. We're coming in to get her, or what's left of her. Silas didn't move. He looked at the window of his cabin. The firelight was flickering against the glass. Inside, a girl was dying because a man wanted a piece of dirt and a feeling of power. I've spent 12 years trying to forget how to kill men like you, Silas said. The horse bolted, throwing the deputy into the sagebrush. The second deputy reached for his sidearm, but Silas didn't give him the chance. The Winchester barked again. A clean hit. The man slumped over his pommel, the air leaving his lungs in a wet whistle. Miller, to his credit, was fast. He rolled off his horse as Silas's third shot tore through his saddle horn. Miller hit the dirt and scrambled behind an outcropping of rock, his revolver spitting fire into the darkness. A bullet grazed Silas's shoulder, tearing the heavy wool of his coat and leaving a trail of fire across his skin. Silas didn't flinch. He walked toward the rock, step by slow, deliberate step. You think you're the only one who knows the desert, Miller? Silas shouted. I was scouting these canyons when you were still wet behind the ears. I know every shadow. I know every stone. Silas dropped a rifle. He didn't need it anymore. He pulled the Colt. Miller was screaming now. Taunts. Threats. But his voice was cracking. He realized that the man walking toward him wasn't a rancher. He was a ghost. She's dead anyway. Miller shrieked from behind the rock. You can kill me, but you can't save her. I won, Silas. I won. Silas reached the edge of the rock. He didn't peek around it. He didn't play the game. He stepped out into the open, his chest a broad target in the moonlight. Miller fired. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. Silas stood over him. Miller looked up, his face twisted in a mask of pure animal terror. Is it over yet? Silas asked, echoing the girl's moan. He didn't wait for an answer. The Colt bucked in his hand once. Just once. Silas stood in the silence for a long time. The only sound was a crackle of the dying fire on the deputy's saddle and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had just finished a chore he'd put off for too long. He walked back to the cabin. His shoulder was bleeding. His heart was heavy, and the weight of the years felt like a mountain on his back. He opened the door. The heat was still there, but the whistle had stopped. He walked to the blankets. Sarah was still. Her eyes were closed. The gray was gone, replaced by a waxen, peaceful white. She looked like she was sleeping. For the first time in her life, maybe she looked like she was afraid. Silas looked at the clock. 1 o'clock. On the dot. He sat down in his rocking chair. He didn't put the gun away. He just sat there, watching the fire die down to embers. He watched the light fade from the room until the only thing left was a steady, rhythmic tick of the brass clock. He stayed there until the sun began to bleed over the eastern peaks, turning the Nevada desert into a sea of gold and purple. The next morning, Silas Vance dug a grave under the lone cottonwood tree by the creek. It was the only place on the ranch where the ground was soft enough to hold a secret. He didn't say much. He didn't have a Bible, and he didn't have a priest. He just placed a locket in her hands and covered her with the earth she had died to keep. You know, they say that out here in the West, time is a circle, that the same stories keep happening to different people. The same greed, the same cruelty, the same quiet men standing in the doorway, refusing to move. Maybe they're right. Maybe Sarah was just a passenger in a story that started long before she was born. But as Silas stood over that mound of fresh dirt, he realized something. The poison had worked. Yes, it had taken her life. But it hadn't taken her soul. She had died in a warm house, held by a man who cared, far away from the hands of the man who had tried to break her. In the end, that's all any of us can ask for. A little bit of mercy before the clock stops. So, I have to ask you, if you were Silas Vance and you knew that clock was ticking, would you have opened that door? Would you have taken on a fight you knew you couldn't when, in the way the world counts, winning? Think about that while you finish your tea. Life doesn't always give us a happy ending, but it does give us a choice. We can be the poison, or we can be the sanctuary. If this story touched a place in you